Okay, here we go with Chapter 2 of our Caro-Kann Repertoire course. This is the advanced variation when white does not play move 4 c3.
Yep, so we can go through the normal moves here. You may have seen this variation. We've covered this on our YouTube channel. So the very first move that is kind of like a decision in the road for the Caro is we're recommending right away this 3c5 move. And this move packs a punch for sure. We're putting white to the decision right away, and we showed earlier that actually at the club level, 3c5 score, it's like 55% wins for black. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, so c5 scored the best, and black tends to have an advantage in quite a few of the lines. So in this chapter, we are not going to look at the main move, which is 4 c3. We're going to be looking at 4 takes c5, 4 knight f3, 4 c4, and 4 f4. So 4 different moves. This is going to be a 10 chapter or a 10 variation chapter again. Each chapter is approximately 10% of what you'll see in the games within the chapter.
Yep. And I have personally seen every single one of these moves in my game, and I've only been playing Decaro now for probably 2 or 3 months, something like that. So ready to actually know what to do against each of these variations. So um, first, should we look at D takes?
Yeah, let's go through the main line.
Okay.
So here we're recommending e6. This puts an immediate attack on the c5 pawn, and it's actually best to let us capture this pawn. So if you see your opponent play a3 after the capture, that's the most popular move at the grandmaster level. But we're first going to start with the most popular move at the club level, which is bishop to e3.
Yep. So I like the move e6 because it allows us to immediately attack this pawn and just put the pressure on white again. So I think it's very natural for white to defend the pawn, bringing the bishop, defending the pawn. Very normal looking move and makes a ton of sense. So from here, we just continue putting the pressure on, play knight d7, and now we're attacking these two pawns. And again, it's up to white to say which pawn do you want to hold and how do you plan on doing that.
And one nice thing with this line is there's a lot of ways for your opponent to go wrong. So they have to figure out how to defend the pawn, and a lot of the options aren't that great for white. So in this position, we're going to look at 2 moves. We'll look at bishop to b5, and we'll also look at knight to f3. We'll start with the most popular move, bishop to b5. And after this move, we're recommending a rare response, queen to a5 check. And the reason I recommend this move is because there's a forced sequence and it puts a lot of pressure on white right away on the 6th move.
Yeah, so bishop out here defends both of these pawns tactically because this knight is pinned to the king. So what we're going to do is basically get out of this pressure, and we're going to play basically very forcefully. So in this position, the only move that makes any sense right here is knight c3, because keep in mind we're attacking the bishop. So getting the knight out and defending the bishop. So they play knight out, and we're gonna again just ask them the question right away what they're gonna do with this bishop. And so we're gonna play a6 and have them make a decision. And really, the only move that makes sense here again is to take the knight, and we take back here with the king, right? Oh no, sorry, we take back with the
With the
bishop.
bishop. That's in the other repertoire, the aggressive king repertoire.
Yeah, this is the delayed bomb cloud.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say it. So now the strongest move for white is a3. And the idea behind a3 is white wants to allow us to capture. This is a bit of a trick, a trap. If we take right away, there's pawn to b4, forking our bishop and queen. So instead of taking right away, we need to retreat the queen first. Queen back to c7. And now again, we're putting the pressure on the white pawns in the center. Bishop takes c5 as one threat, queen takes e5 as another threat, and white has to figure out how do we defend both of these threats that black has.
Yep, and Another very natural looking move here is b4. And in white, I feel if you're playing the white pieces here, I feel like you'd be very happy until you see the next move on the board, which is b6, because it completely undermines this beautiful chain. And if you decide you want to go ahead and capture this pawn, whoops, you hang a knight. So a beautiful move to really undermine everything. And really, I think if you see this move on the board, you're already like a little bit defeated. Like I had this beautiful pawn chain, I was up the extra pawn, and now we're going to get to material equality, and this pawn chain is not going to be looking as hot anymore. So b6 here really equalizes, and actually black is just quite a bit better.
Yeah, the position's really starting to fall apart for white already with these dark square weaknesses. E5, knight on c3, the two pawns you highlighted, b4, a3. So here the most popular move, and it's the only good move according to the engine, is to play c6 and just toss this pawn to us. If white doesn't play c6, we're going to take on c5, and that variation is even stronger for us. So c6, queen takes c6. We already have a nice little advantage, and our plan now is going to be to play knight e7 to g6, and this follows the other chapters in the repertoire where we see we want to go after the weakest white pawn on the board, which in this case it's the pawn on e5. So there's no pawn on d4. That means we want the knight on g6 to hit e5. And then our plan is going to be develop the f8 bishop to e7, castle, and play f6. And the nice thing with f6, and we see this in other chapters too, is if the f pawn trades for the e pawn, so these two pawns trading, it actually gives us two center pawns, and we can start pushing that advantage up the board in combination with our bishop pair.
Yep, and it seems kind of like white just wandered into this position. They played all very natural looking moves, and black is just has everything to play for here. No weaknesses at all in black's camp. All these pawns are very safe, very secure, and we have the bishop pair. And white just has all sorts of loose pieces. This knight is undefended right now. This pawn is undefended, and lots of initiative here for white
Initiative for black, yeah.
or for black,
Yeah,
not white.
that's right.
For black.
So let's go back to move 6 for white. We'll run it from the top. So we have the advanced variation, 3c5, d takes c, e6, bishop e3, knight d7. Now at this point, let's look at a natural looking developing move, knight to f3. This does allow us to capture on c5 right away. And the easiest way for us to get out of this bit of congestion that we have on the 7th and 8th rank is to take with the bishop. Bishop takes c5. And now the main option for white is to recapture. Bishop takes c5. We go knight takes c5. And we have this plan of knight e7, bishop d7, castle, and we have the extra center pawn on d5.
Yep. So very, very normal continuation here. Um, I remember when I was first playing this, it seemed like I kind of wanted to take with the knight, but then your bishop is pretty boxed in. This e7 square is really where you want to put your knight in the future, so it makes a lot of sense here to take with the bishop, allow this trade, and just play the position. This d pawn is looking pretty nice. I could see it becoming a pass pawn one day if white ever gets a little too aggressive. And again, no weaknesses in our camp, and we can get quick pressure on this advanced e pawn with the knight on the g file right now.
And one thing white can do here is try to attack our c5 knight. So the knight on c5 is a bit clumsy, and they can do that with queen d4. But if we're aware of this move coming, we can actually counter it pretty well with queen b6. And the idea now is we're going to go knight e7, and that knight from e7 could probably hit this queen on d4 with tempi, and the queen will have to make an extra move. We're developing fast, and we have at least an equal position with the extra d pawn still.
Yep, and this b2 pawn is looking pretty tender as well, so that's another kind of threat we have going for us. And yeah, I can just toss the engine on here real quick, and it says, yeah, equal black, teeny tiny bit better.
We'll take it.
Yeah.
So the game could continue knight b to d2. That was the most popular move.
Hmm.
Knight to e7. Again, we want to castle and either bring the knight to c6 or f5, hitting the queen. And now the most popular move is knight to b3. And at this point, white actually wants a queen trade because our queen is probably going to be stronger than the queen on d4. And we don't have anything better to do here than to allow the queen trade because white does have this pin. Um, so the most common sequence and what we recommend is knight takes b3, a takes b3, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, knight g6, hitting the pawn on e5. And then what would you say here the plan is, Jesse, for black, for us?
Um, I would say, well, we have good pressure on this e pawn, so white's going to have to come up with a plan to defend that pretty quickly. Um, I don't see actually a way to. I suppose I can move the knight back and defend that way. So I think plan is to. Um, I don't feel like we want a castle here. Maybe keep our king in the center since we're kind of in an end game. And okay, yeah. So undermine with f6. Okay, good idea.
Yeah, and our king can sit on e7. He's very safe there. If we can get the extra center pawn, we can use that to our advantage as well. So if we have two center pawns against none, we can start push them up the middle of the board.
Yeah, I was just thinking too. If we undermine it with f6 and takes, we could even take with the probably should take with the g pawn. Then we have this big center mass here.
Yeah, definitely. And that's like a common theme in this repertoire course as well. So when I used to play the Caro-Kann quite often as a tournament player, sometimes I would get pretty boring, dry positions from the black side. One thing that we're doing in this repertoire is we recommend f6 quite a bit as a way to really play for some dynamic positions and some center control. And I think that greatly increases the winning chances compared to, for example, just playing king e7, bishop d7, not pushing the f pawn. At that point, you don't really have a lot to play for, but once you see this f6 idea, then we can create some more winning chances in the position.
Yep, and you'll see it commonly too in other lines here where maybe we already castled and we want to open up this f file for the rook. So it's a pretty common theme throughout the repertoire.
Yeah, definitely. So now let's go back to move 5. Instead of bishop e3, let's look at 5a3. So right here, we're going with a3. This is the grandmaster move. If you see this move, you can be pretty confident that your opponent has studied this before because a3 is not natural. a3 lets us take the pawn, and then they're going to expand with b4.
Yep, A3 here. We mentioned this a little bit in the free YouTube video too. Is A3 is really the critical test for this line. So we'll go through it here, and yeah, like Matt said, once you see A3, you kind of know that you're playing against someone who has a little bit more theory in this line, and maybe they know what they're doing, or maybe they're higher rated. So A3, very weird, unnatural move. Again, if I saw my 5-year-old play this move, I'd be like, "What are you doing? There's so much more to do here. Don't play a3." But he would have known better than my. So after a3, we do just capture the pawn, and I see here we have a couple different recommendation, or I guess a couple different lines for white.
Yeah, let's first look at b4, direct attack on the bishop. So this is also in the bonus chapter, like Jesse mentioned. In that chapter, we went more in depth specifically on some of these lines. And for the main repertoire, we wanted to cover more of the earlier sidelines that you're more likely to see in the game. So definitely check out that bonus chapter if you want to see more variations in this line. But in this position, there's two main retreats, bishop b6 and bishop e7. We are recommending bishop e7 throughout the repertoire, and the reason for that is we want to keep this bishop pressuring the white queenside pawns because later on we will attack them with a5 and try to chip away at the weaknesses on the white queen side.
Yep, exactly. And it's a little bit awkward because this is usually a very happy square for our knight. But as you can see, we're going to be undermining the pawns very quickly here. And so the bishop on this diagonal makes a lot of sense for our plan. So it starts with a fianchetto bishop, and we're going to immediately strike with a5, keeping in line with our undermining plan here.
And the most common move for white is to play b5, which takes away the c6 square for our knight. But once this pawn moves up to b5, it also gives us control of the c5 square. So we're going to take advantage of that by, instead of playing knight c6, we're playing knight d7. So it's eyeing these dark squares and it's also eyeing the pawn on e5. And this is going to start to give us some dynamic play.
Yeah, so white could respond with a move like knight f3. And here we're going to get our knight out to a slightly unconventional square, knight h6. So we want to get castled, and obviously this is the only square for the knight to develop. So we want to put it here with the eyes on f5 someday. Or maybe we're going to go back to this f6 idea as a plan in the future too. So bishop d3 is a solid move here. We're going to get castled. White's going to castle. And now we are going to play b6. What's the idea behind b6?
So what we'd like to do now is continue our play on the queen side. So we can play moves like bishop b7, rook c8, knight c5, increase all of the scope of the queen side pieces. And we also have a plan of playing f6 on the king side. And after we play f6, if white takes, we have both bishop, knight, and rook all guarding that square, and white just has the b2 bishop on it. And one thing I could add from a couple of moves ago, when we played knight h6, the reason knight h6 works well is because the white queenside bishop is on b2, so it's not sitting on c1, potentially pointing at our knight on h6.
Yep, exactly. And there's even some lines where we're okay accepting that, but here we don't even need to think about it. So
Right.
knight h6, again, not a super common move that we will recommend, but it does kind of pop in here and there when it's natural. So here it's very natural. It's the only other two knight developing squares are taken. And I believe that was the end of that line, right? b6 was the
Right.
end.
So we
Okay.
can go back to move 6. So this is where white played b4. The other line
hmm
we'll look at is queen g4. And these can be pretty uncomfortable. The queen's hitting g7. The only ways to guard the g7 pawn are bishop f8, g6, or king f8. And none of those options look very good. This is going to be the sharpest line we recommend in the chapter, but we're actually going to gambit the pawn. And we talk about this in our bonus chapter as well. But the recommendation here is knight e7. And we want to play for quick development. And yeah, we don't care if we lose the g7 pawn and potentially the h7 pawn because we're going to be coming at white pretty quickly, attacking the e5 pawn, potentially playing queen b6, eyeing b2 and f2. And it's going to be on white to find tough moves to make sure that we don't get a big attack coming up.
Yep, and if white doesn't take the pawn here and just plays a move, we can just castle and kind of continue with our normal standard Carol setup. So for this line, we're going to mostly look at how do we get out of this, right? Queen takes the pawn, hitting the rook, hitting h6. So very natural move here. Rook g8. It's a little it's a little uncomfortable because obviously we can no longer castle kingside, which is very common throughout pretty much the entire repertoire. So this is, if there's one line to really memorize, I think it's probably checking out this early queen g4 line. So we play the tempo on the queen, and we can look at a line here where the queen keeps being greedy, capturing the h7 pawn. And here we're really looking for very rapid development and trying to punish kind of this queen that's on our side of the board. And look at all of White's pieces, sadly, on the back rank.
That's right. So we're going to play knight b to c6 now, putting the immediate pressure on this e5 pawn. And after knight f3, which is the most common move, but it's actually a small mistake, we can hit white with a really quick queen b6, and our double attack on this f2 pawn, queen and bishop battery lined up, there's no good defense for white. It looks like, well, maybe they could try queen h4, but after that we have a really simple reply. Knight f5, kicking the queen, and the f2 pawn is going to drop.
Yep. So White got a couple pawns here, but look at all this activity we have. This pawn is falling. This queen could be subject to many different attacks coming in the future. And we're we're even pressuring this b2 pawn, so it's awkward for white to get a bishop out anywhere. Where is this king gonna go once this f2 pawn drops? Um, Something we mentioned in the YouTube video is this early queen, like we're sacrificing these pawns. Our king is kind of caught in the middle, but whose king is safer in this position? Very clearly, black's king.
Yeah, definitely. And once we take f2, the white king is going to be on the run and not very happy. So the, the main move is bishop to d3. We grab the free pawn. There's a couple of king moves here. The most popular is king f1, which also guards the pawn on g2. We complete our development of the minor pieces, bishop d7. And now the plan is actually to queenside castle. And after we queenside castle, we'll retreat this bishop off of f2, either back to d4 or c5. But we're going to have a big attack against the white king at the cost of only one pawn.
Yeah, and just look at the happy rook on this file, and then we're gonna bring another rook over to point it at white's king. White is gonna be not having much fun, and sacrificed one pawn, but I'd be having a lot of fun in this position.
What's the eval here? Can we take a peek at the stockfish
Yeah, let
eval?
me turn it on. It says it's thinking negative, coming -2 about one -1.7. If they find the move a4, it's -1.7. Without a4, it's -2.5.
Perfect. Yeah, so we have a pretty big attack here. We definitely have more than a pawn worth of compensation.
Oh yeah.
So next let's go to move 5, knight f3. So again, this chapter is sort of the sidelines after d takes c5. So we're looking at a lot of early deviations. So right here, knight f3 guards the e5 pawn, which isn't being attacked currently, and allows us to quickly take the pawn on c5.
Yep. Good rule of thumb too is if ever we can capture this pawn with the bishop, we're pretty much going to. I don't think there's an exception to that in our recommendations. Um, Assuming you're not just hanging a bishop if it's defended or something. So, oh yeah, I even see the note here. We usually take the pawn when it's available. So a sample sample line here: bishop d3, natural looking move, and we're going to play our knight out to knight e7. I have an idea that this knight is coming to g6 in the future.
Yeah, so the knight from g6 again hits the weakest white pawn in the center. There's no pawn on d4.
Hmm.
Um, One thing to keep an eye on here is when you see the bishop on d3 and our knight on e7, we have to watch the h7 pawn for Greek gift ideas. So after a knight e7 castle, do not castle kingside here because bishop takes h7 is very close to winning, if not winning for white already.
I think it is winning for white.
Yeah, I think I looked at the computer and it was like 4 pawn advantage already.
Yeah, and you have to go up because if you go back, this is just bad. So this is not what you want out of the Caro. So uh, one thing to remember: don't allow the great gift. So here we're going to instead play the nice calm knight g6. No great gift ideas. Get some pressure on this pawn. Oops.
So now usually we'll see rook e1 in this position, putting an extra defender on e5. We could castle here, but it'll probably transpose to the recommended move, knight to c6. So the idea with knights to c6 is we're going to just keep building pressure on this weak pawn. Maybe play queen c7, eventually castle kingside, and kind of put the question to white, how are you going to make progress while we keep increasing pressure on the center?
Yep, exactly. And I like that we're not going into many permutations once we get kind of this like move 7 into the line. It's because a lot of these move orders are gonna either transpose to each other or the plans are gonna be so similar anyway that it doesn't really pay to spend a ton of time analyzing, well, what if they just push the A pawn or try to sack a pawn here? It's like you're gonna be able to use the principles kind of discussed throughout the book and probably make a right decision, or at least a decision that's not going to get you into a ton of trouble. So after knight c6, c3 is played for white, and here we're just going to bring on a little more pressure to this e-pawn. So if we get another free move, we can win the e-pawn. So white's going to have to defend it in some way.
And there was also this idea for white with c3 where they might play b4 and b5, kicking our minor pieces. Queen c7 is a nice way to prepare for this, because if the pawn goes all the way to b5, like Jesse said, we're actually going to win the e5 pawn. So kicking our knight on c6 is not a big deal. In this position, queen e2 is the main move, putting a third defender on this pawn. Now our recommendation is to castle, and then the plan going forward is similar to some other lines we've seen. We want to play f6. Sorry, I undid your highlight, Jesse. f6 and build a big center. If e takes f6, we're actually going to take with the g pawn, and we're not afraid of having a missing g pawn because our center is so strong and there's no good way for white to attack us.
Yep, and then tuck the king away on h8 someday, bring a rook over, and then all this pressure down on the g file. So yeah, it's a nice way to play for a little more than just a boring old Caro-Kann position, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So now let's go back to the next move 5 option for white, which is b4. b4, you can tell right away, it's a bit shaky of a move because all of these dark squares are open in white's position. Um, and our plan is going to be to quickly undermine these pawns right away.
Yep. So an immediate a5 here, and white or yeah, sorry, white can't really defend it. If they take here, whoops, we get a free rook. So white has something. They have a decision to make here. How are they going to hold the structure together? And spoiler, they can't.
Right. So
So
c3 is the main move here. Um, that way you don't drop the rook in the corner. And after a takes b, c takes b, we have this very thematic idea where we just keep chipping away at the pawns. So b6 hitting c5. It's only guarded by the b pawn, but we also have our f8 bishop, which is eyeing both the pawns on c5 and b4.
mhm. Yep, and we already have this half open a file for our own rook. So things are opening up in our favor already. Like Matt highlighted earlier, these dark squares all around in White's camp are just incredibly weak, and this structure is going to be falling very quickly. So here, White can play Bishop b5 check, and here we're going to. Are we blocking? Yeah, I see. We're blocking with the bishop. Um, is there anything you wanted to say about Bishop b5 check?
One other thing we could mention here is if white were to play bishop to e3, we can actually go b takes c, and knight d7, hitting both the pawns. So just another thing to keep in mind. But bishop b5 check is the most common move that you're likely to see, because when you see white play b4, they tend to be a more aggressive player, and this is the aggressive continuation.
Mm. It almost seems like, oh, well, I don't know how to resolve this tension, so I'll just give a check.
Exactly. I'll trade off my good bishop on the light squares.
Yeah, and we're happy to oblige. So they take. And here we have a few different captures. I think taking with the queen is probably a mistake because they can capture the b pawn. So we're going to want to capture with the knight. And now we have even more pressure here on the c pawn. And if they take here, we can capture back probably either of these ways, and we're doing just fine.
Right, and one thing to keep in mind here, if this c pawn moves, either c takes b6 or c6, we actually have bishop takes b4 check. So we can do this in between check before we win back the b pawn or go after the e pawn. So that's something to keep in mind. The most common move here is knight f3, giving up the c pawn, defending this. But now we get a really comfortable position after takes, bishop c5.
Yep, and we're going to continue with our standard plan. Knight e7 to knight g6, I assume. Attack this pawn some more. Castle king side, and just use our extra, you know, scope of our pieces. We have very strong pieces here, and win the game.
Yes, definitely. So 5b4 is really not a variation we need to be afraid of, even though it looks pretty aggressive, because we just have this very straightforward plan of undermining it with the queenside pawns.
Yep, it's just way too premature to try to hold the pawn in that way.
So let's go to move 4, knight f3 for white.
Let's see if I can find it. Knight f3.
Oh, sorry, back a couple.
Oh, 4 knight f3.
Yeah, right here.
This knight f3. Got
Yes.
it.
So in this position, knight f3, white is not capturing on c5, and they're not guarding the d pawn with the c3 pawn. So in this case, we actually want to draw the knight out to d4, but it's not that bad of a line for white. White can still play for the advantage here, so this is definitely something that we want to learn and have down pat.
Yep. So two main captures here that we're going to go over. Should we start with the knight capture?
Yeah, that sounds good. And this is the most popular move. I have in the notes by about 4-1, so probably 4 times more common than queen takes d4.
Yeah, queen takes d4 runs into this immediate tempo, so knight takes is much more natural. So knight c6, we're going to go after the knight right away. Like you said, a lot of times white will play c4 and invite this trade. So what is the idea behind knight c6?
Yeah, so with knight c6, we're actually quickly attacking white's center. We're not giving white the time to play c4. But if the white player is very aggressive, and most of them are in this type of position, bishop b5 is going to come next. Now what's happening is because we played aggressive and they're fighting our aggressive move with more aggression, we have to go down this line that does get a bit tactical. So this is definitely one to learn and memorize. We need to play bishop d7 here to defend this knight twice. And in
Hmm.
this position, bishop takes c6 is the most popular move, but I'm not covering that one in depth because there's actually nothing to be afraid of there. The move that we need to watch out for, or after bishop takes c6, I should say, we take with the pawn. The move we need to watch out for here is actually e6.
Hmm. Yep. So kind of a move where if you see you're like, oh man, what did I get into? Because this f pawn is gonna uh, really the only move here is to capture with the f pawn. Otherwise, you're just gonna allow them to capture here, and we don't want that. So these light squares are pretty weak. So that's going to be the main uh, purpose behind this e6 move. So where this is the first line we've seen where white is really kind of playing for the initiative, and we're kind of reacting. But the good news is I just turned on Stockfish. It says black is doing just fine objectively, but there's some very, there's some sharp stuff that you need to at least be aware of.
And
So in this position, there's a few different moves, but they all kind of mean the same type of thing. So we're going to cover the immediate bishop capture, and here we're going to take back with our pawn. And I like this because we have a nice big pawn mass. We have four pawns on on these files, and white only has the one c pawn. So it's looking good. Our bishop is a little buried, but we're going to be able to liberate it pretty quickly.
yeah, and this is the most common move for white, 8 bishop takes c6. And
Mhm.
after b takes c, queen h5 check is most common. And the nice thing with this position, even though we are under a bit of an attack from white, all the trades will help us out. And even if white wins the pawn back on e6, if the queens come off the board, we are likely going to have a pawn on e5, a pawn on d5, and a pawn on c6 with the two bishops still. So really, as long as we get the queens off the board, we should be in good shape. Or if we can get our pieces developed and our king to g8, we should also be in good shape.
Yeah, and I am 100% sure that the best move here is g6. Also,
Yeah.
maybe the only legal move. And we're pushing white's queen backwards or sideways, I guess. So queen e5 attacking our rook. And we have a very natural kind of, again, only move on the board that makes any sort of sense is blocking the queen attack and developing a piece. So play knight up, and this does allow white to capture this weak e6 pawn, since now there's two attacks on there on that pawn, and we only have one defender. So white does go ahead and capture. We're going to capture back. We're more than happy to make this trade because A, our queen is under attack and it gets very awkward if we want to start moving it. And also, this bishop is a bit of a problem piece anyway, so we're happy just to swap it off for the knight that's deep in our territory.
Yeah, so after white plays queen takes e6, queen d7, offering the queen trade, there's really no better move for white than to trade queens because otherwise we are most likely going to play bishop g7, castle, and get our e5 push in sooner rather than later. So after queen takes d7, king takes d7, now we're playing e5 and our endgame is quite a bit better.
Yep, totally not scary anymore. I just want to highlight, like, let's say we go back to this move, to this position. They just play a retreat. Well, now we get this bishop coming out here with a ton of scope. We have a great rook. We're going to castle. We have the open f file. So it's an open position, and we have a lot of scope for all of our pieces. So we shouldn't be afraid of. I just played kind of a random move that I saw Stockfish somewhat approved of. So black is still doing just fine here, and there's nothing, there's nothing to be afraid of here. And we're going to be able to, like Matt said, just push these pawns up the board.
Yeah, and our position might even be stronger with this having those center pawns with queens on the board once our king gets to safety, which it's going to do next move.
Yep.
All right, so let's go back to move 5 and look at queen takes d4.
See if I can try to figure this out.
So this is for knight f3. Oh, I'll help.
You
That's
do
okay.
it. I'm
Yeah, I
lost.
got some notes here. I got notes. Okay, for knight f3, c takes d, queen takes d. There we go. So this move, it is also aggressive because there's ideas of bishop to b5, pinning our c6 knight, and then also maybe swinging the queen over to the king side to tie us down a bit. So sort of similar to that other line we looked at where white played queen g4 trying to tie us down. Sometimes they can make our development a bit uncomfortable.
Mhm. So we're going to play for the tempo, knight c6, and white is going to um, excuse me, white is going to pin the knight. Doesn't really make sense to make any other move because you take with the queen and then go straight back. Although I hear that's pretty good in the Scandinavian, but
Right.
maybe that's for another repertoire. And we are going to respond with e6. So slightly awkward move here, blocking in our bishop, but it's very safe and it's very solid, just kind of reinforcing this pawn. And anything else you want to say about e6?
Yeah, we also have the structural advantage here. So we have the extra d pawn. It's nice and solid, and its counterpart is this pawn on c2. And the fact that this queen is already being attacked and we can play bishop d7 with threats of knight takes e5. Obviously the queen's being attacked. White's going to probably lose another tempi or two just to get their pieces developed. So it's okay that we're trapping in this light square bishop temporarily. It's not anything we need to be too concerned about.
Yep, so white castles, and we're going to kind of continue with another standard plan, knight e7. Here, I think there's merits for both of these landing squares for the knight. So we have this advanced slash weak e pawn. A lot of times you want to come to g6, but we can also take the tempo the other way too. But not get ahead of ourselves. White gets an extra move because it's his turn. Bishop g5, and now we're in major pin land. So both of our knights are pinned.
Yes, and we can attack those bishops and force them to choose what to do. So I think the best move here is h6. That's what we recommend. And I believe the second best move is actually a6, attacking the other bishop. One thing I really like about this line after h6, in an opening like the Caro-Kann, you tend to think it's solid and it's not very aggressive. But when we play h6 here, and the center is all closed, and our king's not on the king side, it's in the center, we are actually thinking of g5 and a huge kingside attack here. So when we play h6, the best move for white is to actually take on e7, but the most common move is a mistake, bishop h4. And it's a mistake because of the kingside attack. And one thing I really like about our repertoire is we're always looking for lines that give the opponent tough questions. And if the most popular move is a mistake, and those are chances right there for us to get big advantages straight out of the opening. So let's look at the most popular move, bishop to h4.
Yep, these pawns are coming real quick. So, like Matt just said, we're going to play the immediate g5. Nothing at all to worry about the sacrifice here. We just we're just up a piece. So only move really that makes sense is to retreat the bishop again. And now we have a very nice knight move here, forking the dark squared bishop and the queen.
Yeah, so now the most common move was queen to a4, applying extra pressure to the knight on c6, also slowing down our king side attack slightly. So bishop to d7 is recommended. And now the next move is going to be h5. Um, so one thing I did here is I just sort of continued play without a lot of notes, giving the most popular moves for white and then the strongest moves for black. Play could continue rook d1, pawn h5, and if white tries to stop these pawns, we have a pretty straightforward sequence. Knight takes g3, f takes g3, g takes h4, g takes h4, bishop c5 check. This attack looks very strong, and if you turn the engine on, Stockfish is already saying we're up 4 or 5 pawns because of the attack against the white king.
Yeah, and White's king is just wide open. The dark squares are super weak, and our bishop is just the MVP of this position right here. We're going to bring the rook into the game. Even this h4 pawn is very weak, so very, very deadly, scary attack here.
Yeah, I would definitely like playing this line as black.
Yeah.
So now let's go back to, I'll direct us back to move 4. Let's look at c4. This is a very sharp move, and when I've played Caro-Kann in my tournament games, I never really felt comfortable seeing these c4 lines. One, because I didn't know them very well, and two, because I always looked for a more solid position.
Yep. So as white, I like this move because it is very aggressive. It grabs more space and it just creates a lot of this tension. And a lot of the time, club players just want to immediately resolve the tension. And here we're actually going to resolve the tension in a favorable way for us. So we're going to play c takes d4. And, white could play gambit style, but we're going to look at the move queen takes immediately. And we're going to not, so we can't play knight c6 here because we dropped the d5 pawn. So we're instead going to reinforce with e6.
And this is potentially accepting an isolated queen pawn, but we are going to develop the pieces very quickly. There's likely to be a queen trade because if white doesn't trade queens, we probably get a quick initiative. So the most common move here is c takes d5. And now we have this cool idea. We can play knight c6. The d pawn is pinned, so white cannot take our knight currently. And after bishop to b5, now we play queen takes d5 and we tell white, okay, you can give us the IQP, but you need to trade queens to get into that IQP position, and we're going to have very quick play with our minor pieces and definitely have full compensation for the potential weakness of the isolated queen pawn.
Yeah, and it's not just an isolated queen pawn. If we go into here, that's actually a pass pawn too. So in an end game, that it's a little unclear if this is going to be a strength or a weakness. So it's a bit double-edged, but we should not be afraid of an isolated queen pawn, especially since it could be a queen of its own someday. So most common, so like Matt said, really the main move here is to trade queens. Keep in mind their bishop is under attack, so they can't just swing a queen out or anything. So trade queens, we get the isolated queen pawn, and white's going to continue their development with tempo on this pawn with knight c3. And what's the move here? Bishop b4, pinning the knight, defending the pawn tactically.
Yeah, and our plan in the next couple of moves, we have knight g to e7 on deck, potentially play d4, like Jesse was saying. We can castle. The light square bishop is probably coming out to f5 or g4, but it also could come out to e6. So the most common move here is bishop to d2 for white. And after this, we're going to develop our last kingside piece, knight to e7. And our plan now is castle. And I actually have a couple pawn moves here in our repertoire plans, a6 and even f6. And when I first saw f6, this move surprised me. But what I like about f6 is the white king is still in the middle. And after we castle, our rook is sitting on f8. If our f pawn trades off for e, we're actually bringing extra pressure down the f file, and our dark bishop could maybe relocate to c5. So even though this position gives a computer eval of right around 0, scores around 50%, I think there's still a lot of chances for both sides to play for a win, and that's something that we go for in the repertoire. We always want positions where we have some chances to play for the win.
And f6 will come after castling, right?
Right, yeah, so then we
Yeah,
could take back with the rook. That's
yeah.
right.
And then, yep, then we have the open f-file for the rook. So, yeah, I think that's the end of this line. Did we have another line, or is that it?
Last one. So on move
Oh, okay,
4,
good. Save the best for last.
yeah, there's this kind of crazy idea, f4. Um, it's sort of similar to the lines we were looking at with b4 after d takes c5, where it was just a bit shaky and a bit loose on the dark squares. This is loose on the dark squares, but if you see your opponent play f4 on move 4, you can be pretty sure that they know this system well and they know how to set up their pieces. And we want to make sure that the game is not in their court. So these are lines you could look at even a little more outside of our repertoire if you know a specific opponent is going to play it. I definitely recommend it, but it is pretty rare. So it's less than 10% of the lines in this chapter, even though we aim for 10%. I think it's around 5 or 6%.
Yep, so I have the master's database open here. And in this position, there's about maybe 3,500 games. And there are nobody playing F4 at the grandmaster level. So it's dubious, but it's at the club level, you're going to see it. I've seen it in my own games for sure.
Yeah. So again, the best thing to do, since we don't see c3 and we did not see d takes c, we take this pawn right away. We are not allowing white to end up with a pawn on d4. So the most common move here is knight f3, because if queen takes d4, we'll kick with knight to c6.
Yep. So I think that's an important thing to note is to take this pawn right away because if we allow white to capture this pawn, this e3 move doesn't come with quite as much punch because now e5 is defended by this pawn, and bringing the knight out doesn't really help us that much. So we're going to immediately capture this pawn and try to show that this is going to be weak for white in the next few moves. So knight f3, and we're going to pin the knight to the queen so he can't just immediately capture the pawn and win the pawn back. And it's also getting the bishop out of this pawn chain so you don't have to bury it in with a move like e6.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. So once the bishop's outside the pawn chain, and then we play e6, we have all these pawns on light squares, and we have the bishop on dark squares remaining, assuming the light square bishop will probably trade off eventually. So positionally, it's just a very nice setup where the light square pawns in the center complement our minor pieces nicely. Now here, this is another case where the most popular move, queen takes d4, is actually a mistake. Do you see, Jesse, how we can permanently ruin white's pawn structure here?
Oh yeah, just snag the knight. I wouldn't think about it more than like a second. But yeah, immediately snag the knight, and now these pawns are so weak, and these dark squares around the king are uh, fatal. If I'm going to be dramatic, our and keep in mind we still have this dark square bishop that is I feel like it's just going to haunt white for the rest of the game. So g takes only move. We're going to play e6 to free up our bishop, also reinforce his pawn a little more. And yeah, white, like I see the comment here, white is in trouble already. Um, Open queen, we're going to win a tempo with the queen someday, and bishop is going to come to a really juicy square in the future. So our pieces are coming to life very quickly already.
Yeah, definitely. The most popular move for white is bishop to e3, after which we will play knight c6, hitting the queen. And usually when knight c6 hits the queen, the opponent will pin the knight when available. So bishop to b5. And then here we can go knight e7, eyeing this really nice square f5, which hits the bishop on e3, queen on d4. And now again, the most popular move is a mistake, but we'll look at it. Knight c3. Here we actually can play a6. And it looks like the position is still close to even on material, but what is Stockfish telling us, Jesse?
Let me see. So Stockfish is saying -3.5. And I believe it's because this light square bishop is practically out of the game at this point.
there's a
So
there's a big tactic here too.
Oh, there is a big tech.
Yeah, so look at the bishop on e3 and the knight on c3. If this d pawn
Oh,
can go up the board one square, we have a huge fork.
yep, that's true. And our queen is backing up this pawn as well. So if white does capture here, we can capture back, and now we have a capture on the queen, or an attack on the queen, and we're threatened. This is just a very sneaky double attack.
Yeah, so white's completely busted here, and this is following the most popular lines for white. So maybe, even though I said f4 was a system opening and your opponent will know it well, maybe when you see f4, you can be a little more confident that your opponent is not a grandmaster in disguise, and it's a bit shaky of a system.
Well, there's zero games at the grandmaster level, so you can be certain they're not a grandmaster.
Yeah. All right, so that was the last variation of our chapter on the advanced variation, moves outside of 4c3. And in the next couple chapters, we will be looking at when white exchanges on d5, both the Panov attack and the exchange variation. So stay tuned for those.
Yep, awesome.